Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing stories ever to come out of the Tennessee mountains. Leave a comment about where you're watching from right now. What we're about to share will make you question every shadow and every whisper of the wind in the Smoky Mountains pine trees. The purpose of this video is to entertain. It is not based on real events. There is no connection between these people and real people, living or dead. Knoxville, which is in the middle of Tennessee, has always been a city of opposites. At the end of the 19th century, when electric streetcars and textile factories were starting to become common, there were still places where the past refused to die. The city felt very different at night, when gas lamps cast dancing shadows on the sidewalks and cobblestone streets wound between red brick buildings. It was like there were two worlds in the same place. One that could be seen in the light and the other that came to life when the sun went down. The city was going through a time of cautious growth in the fall of 1899. The Tennessee River was dark and strong, and it carried cargo boats that helped the local economy. The smell of freshly cut wood mixed with the smell of smoke from factories as sawmills worked non-stop. But there was something in the air that October that the older people could feel but couldn't put their finger on. It was like the calm before a violent storm. Nina Ashford came to Mrs. Crowley's boarding house on a gray Thursday afternoon in this setting. Eleanor was 28 years old, had brown hair that was always pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes looked like they were hiding secrets. She said she was from Nashville and wanted to find a quiet place to stay for a few weeks. Mrs. Crowley, a middle-aged widow who ran the boarding house at the corner of Gay Street and Union Avenue, took Nina in without asking too many questions. The woman paid in advance for 3 weeks, so money was money. Mrs. Crowley didn't know that Nina Ashford wasn't who she said she was. Nina didn't know that the boarding house had its own secrets. Stories buried beneath creaking floorboards and faded wallpaper. The house was more than 50 years old. A spice merchant who got rich during the Civil War built it. He sold supplies to both sides of the war. They said he died suddenly one winter night and was found in the cellar with a look of terror on his face that had frozen. Nina moved into the second-floor room, which was the last one down the hall and faced the back of the property. She could see the small empty garden with wild rose bushes growing all over it, and beyond that, the dark line of trees that marked the start of the forest. For the first few nights, she hardly slept. It wasn't because of strange noises or people she couldn't explain. It was because she was always on edge, always waiting for something to happen. Her bags were still half-packed, as if she might have to leave at any moment. The other people staying at the boarding house were strange. Thomas Blackwell was a religious bookseller who traveled the South preaching the Word and selling illustrated Bibles. He was in his 40s, had a deep voice that echoed in conversations at the dinner table, and looked at people as if he could see right into their souls. Then there was Margaret Sinclair, a retired piano teacher who spent her days stitching and playing sad songs on the out-of-tune piano in the living room. Lastly, there was Dr. Edmund Price, a doctor who said he had come to Knoxville to study some of the diseases that were affecting the coal miners in the area. For the first few days, Nina stayed away from the other guests. She would go downstairs to eat in silence, and then quickly go back to her room. Mrs. Crowley, on the other hand, paid attention to things. She saw that Eleanor always sat with her back to the wall and a clear view of the door. She saw that her eyes looked at every corner of the room before they even relaxed a little. And most importantly, she saw how the young woman shook every time she heard heavy footsteps coming from upstairs, where the attic was locked. It was Dr. Price who first tried to talk. On a chilly morning in November, he found Eleanor on the small back terrace, looking at the mountains far away. The air smelled like the Tennessee mountains in the fall, a mix of damp leaves and churned earth. smoke slowly rose from the chimneys against the gray sky. He talked about the weather and how bad the winter was going to be that year. Elelena only said one word at a time, but there was something in her voice, a weakness hidden behind layers of caution. The doctor saw this, and being naturally and professionally observant, chose not to press. He just said that he was there for her if she needed anything, and then slowly walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. But it was Margaret Sinclair who really got past Elelena's defenses. The piano teacher was naturally kind and motherly without being pushy. One afternoon, while she was playing a sad waltz, she saw Eleanor standing in the living room doorway, as if the music had put her in a trance. Margaret smiled and made an inviting gesture with her head while still playing. Eleanor walked in slowly, sat down in a chair far away, and for the first time since she got there, her face looked less harsh. Music has this strange ability to break down people's defenses and make walls that they have carefully built start to crack. Elelena had silent tears running down her face when Margaret was done playing. The teacher didn't say anything. She just gave the student an embroidered handkerchief and stayed there in silence to support them. It was the start of a strange friendship between two women who, in their own ways, were carrying heavy loads that no one else could see. At the same time, things were changing in the boarding house. Things started to happen that by themselves didn't mean much, but together they made a disturbing pattern. Things moved at night. One morning, Mrs. Crowley saw that the basement door was open, even though she was sure she had locked it. Thomas Blackwell swore he heard voices whispering in his room, muffled conversations that ceased as soon as he lit the lamp. Dr. Price, a man of science and reason, looked for logical reasons. He said that air currents could make strange sounds in an old house. The wood would expand and contract as the temperature changed, which would make creaks and cracks. But even he, in the dead of night, would wake with the unsettling feeling that something was watching him from the darkness. Elelena knew all of this but didn't say anything. Elelena had to secrete a real reason for being in Knoxville, and she knew that something was wrong with that house, something more than natural events or coincidences. That reason had to do with that boarding house and the address she had written down on a yellowed piece of paper months before. There was a sealed envelope in her dresser drawer, hidden under a lot of clothes. Inside, a letter with shaky handwriting and rushed words that told an impossible story. The letter had made its way to Elelena through winding paths, passing from hand to hand until it found her in Nashville. What was written on those pages had completely changed the course of her life, bringing her to that mountain town and that house that seemed to have its own secrets. One December morning, snow started to fall on Knoxville, turning the town into a ghostly scene of white and gray. The covered rooftops created soft shapes against the heavy sky, and the silence the snow brings seemed to amplify every sound within the boarding house. The creaking of the floorboards, the crackling of the fireplace in the living room, the restrained breathing of the guests who were beginning to feel the weight of this forced cohabitation. Elelena woke up that morning with a decision made. She had spent weeks observing, listening, waiting for the right moment. The letter hidden in her drawer burned in her conscience like a live ember. She could no longer postpone what she had come there to do. She went down to breakfast with a new determination in her eyes, something that Mrs. Crowley noticed immediately. The landlady had that keen instinct of someone who had spent decades dealing with people, reading between the lines of every gesture and expression. Margaret Sinclair also noticed the change as they helped themselves to hot porridge and bread with jam. The piano teacher cast worried glances in Elelena's direction. A storm was brewing. She could feel it. And it wasn't just the snowstorm brewing outside. It was something deeper, more dangerous. Something that had to do with the secrets that House had kept for so long. Dr. Price sat by the window, watching the snowflakes swirl in hypnotic eddies. He had his own mysteries, his own reasons for being in that particular boarding house. It wasn't a coincidence, though he tried his best to make it seem casual. His research into miners' illnesses was real, yes, but there was another layer, another purpose that had brought him there. And as he watched Elelenina that morning, he knew the time had come for all the secrets to begin to unravel. Thomas Blackwell didn't show up for breakfast. That in itself wasn't unusual. The religious bookseller usually left early for his visits to the faithful in the area. But something about that particular absence created a strange void at the table, as if an important piece of the puzzle had been removed, leaving a hole that distorted the whole picture. It was Margaret who broke the silence first. In her soft but firm voice, she commented on the sounds she had heard during the night. Footsteps in the hallway, she said. Footsteps going up and down the stairs without apparent destination. And then, around 3 o'clock in the morning, a heavy, dragging sound coming from the attic, as if someone were moving furniture or large objects. Mrs. Crowley visibly paled, her hands trembling as she held her teacup. Elelenina seized the moment, carefully choosing each word. She inquired about the attic. Why was it always locked? What was up there? Mrs. Crowley reacted right away and was defensive. It was none of the guest's business, she replied sharply. There were a lot of old things in the attic that belonged to the previous owner. They weren't interesting to anyone, but her voice showed that she was nervous, and her eyes avoided looking directly at me, instead focusing on a distant point, as if she could see through the walls to the forbidden space at the top of the house. Dr. Price spoke up in a calm, logical voice. There was no reason for tension, he said. Every house has its private spaces, its places that the owners prefer to keep closed. It was perfectly understandable, but there was something in his tone, an overly rehearsed quality that made Elelenina realize he knew more than he let on, much more. The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. The snow continued to fall, growing ever thicker, isolating the guest house from the rest of the city. The streets became impassable, the outside world vanished beneath the white blanket, and the guests found themselves trapped in that house, which seemed to have a life of its own. Elelenina spent hours in her room rereading the letter for the 100th time, memorizing every word, every detail that might be important. The letter had been written by a woman named Catherine, someone Eleanor had never met in person, but with whom she shared an inexplicable connection. Catherine spoke of visions, of dreams that repeated themselves night after night, always the same setting, always the same house in Knoxville. She described the attic in disturbing detail, spoke of specific objects, of stains on the floor, of a west-facing window that was always covered by a heavy curtain. And there was more. Catherine mentioned names, people who had supposedly lived in that house decades before. She spoke of events that had supposedly happened within those walls, dark stories that no one dared to tell aloud. She begged Elelenina to investigate, to uncover the truth that house hid, because Catherine believed that only by revealing the past, only by bringing light to those ancient shadows, would it be possible to break the cycle that kept certain spirits trapped between worlds. Elelenina wasn't a particularly superstitious person. She had a formal education, had studied literature and history, and considered herself rational. But after the letter reached her, strange things began to happen. Vivid dreams where she walked through corridors she had never seen, but somehow deeply recognized. Sensations of déjà vu so intense they were almost painful, and a growing, inexplicable, yet unwavering conviction that she needed to go to Knoxville, to that specific boarding house. As night fell on the snow-covered boarding house, a dense atmosphere settled among the residents. The fireplace crackled in the living room, casting dancing shadows on the faded wallpapered walls. Margaret had made tea for everyone, an attempt to create some normalcy in this increasingly strange situation. Dr. Price leafed through an old book on medicinal botany, but his eyes rarely touched the pages, preferring to observe the others over the edge of the leather-bound volume. Thomas Blackwell finally returned at nightfall, covered in snow up to his shoulders, his face red from the biting cold. He carried with him an air of barely disguised urgency, like someone who had just discovered something disturbing and didn't quite know what to do with that information. He refused the tea offered by Margaret, went straight up to his room without exchanging more than a few words with those present. His footsteps on the stairs sounded heavy, laden with an invisible weight. Elelonina felt her heart race. Something was happening. The pieces were moving on the board, and she wasn't sure if she was prepared for what was to come. Mrs. Crowley also seemed restless, constantly shifting in her chair, adjusting and readjusting the cushions, smoothing the skirt of her dress with nervous, repetitive movements. Her eyes kept avoiding the ceiling, as if refusing to acknowledge the existence of the attic right above their heads. It was Margaret who suggested they tell stories to pass the time. Old Tennessee legends, she proposed. Tales that grandparents used to tell on winter nights, a way to break the tension that hung over everyone like a thick fog. Dr. Price readily agreed, perhaps seeing it as an opportunity to observe the reactions of the others. Mrs. Crowley hesitated, but eventually nodded silently, resigned. Margaret began with a story about travelers lost in the Smoky Mountains, men and women who ventured onto the misty trails and were never seen again. She spoke of strange lights appearing among the trees, leading the unwary to places from which there was no return. Her voice had that hypnotic quality of natural storytellers, each pause calculated, each inflection creating layers of meaning. Dr. Price contributed medical accounts he had collected on his travels. He spoke of mental illnesses, of people who began to see things that others did not, to hear voices whispering impossible truths. He described cases of individuals who developed inexplicable connections with specific places, as if certain buildings emanated some kind of energy that affected sensitive minds. Elelonina felt a chill run down her spine. It was as if he were speaking directly to her, describing exactly what she had experienced in recent months. Mrs. Crowley didn't say anything for a long time, but when she did, her voice was hoarse and full of emotion. She talked about the spice merchant who had built that house and gotten rich during hard times. She talked about how he was obsessed with secrets, hiding things in secret places, and locking doors so that even his own family couldn't get in. And she said, almost in a whisper, that in the last few months of his life, he had always talked about hearing voices coming from the walls and seeing people watching him from the shadows. Elelonina saw her chance. She asked the merchant if he had left anything in the attic, like a record or document that could explain why he was acting so strangely. She did it carefully, almost as if it were a joke. Mrs. Crowley reacted strongly. She suddenly stood up, dropping the teacup she was holding. The dark liquid spilled on the carpet, leaving stains that looked like blood in the flickering light of the fireplace. "There was nothing in the attic," she said with too much force. "Only old furniture, dusty boxes, and worthless things." Then she quickly left the room, and her footsteps echoed down the hall until they faded away toward her private quarters on the ground floor. There was a lot of meaning in the looks that Margaret and Dr. Price gave each other. The silence that followed was thick and heavy with things that weren't said. Margaret broke the moment by softly saying that it was late and everyone should go to bed. But there was a hidden meaning in her words, a warning that something big was about to happen. Elelonina's legs shook as she went up to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the house quiet down for the night. The wind howled outside, making the snow build up against the windows in strange ways. And then, from above, that sound that had become familiar but was still scary, the slow, deliberate dragging of something heavy across the attic floor. She stayed there. She waited until the other rooms were quiet, and only the wind and the creaking of old wood could be heard. Elelena took the lamp and went out into the dark hallway, her heart racing. Her bare feet didn't make a sound on the old carpet. She walked past the closed doors of the other guests and up the narrow stairs to the third floor, where the attic door was. The door was solid and imposing, with its old, heavy lock. Elelena thought the door would be locked, but when she turned the knob, it opened easily, with a long creak that echoed down the stairs. A draft of cold air moved over it, bringing with it a musty smell and something else that was hard to put into words but very unpleasant. Elelena lifted the lamp, and its golden light showed a steep staircase that led up into complete darkness. It was as if the house itself was torn between revealing its secrets and keeping them hidden forever, because each wooden step seemed to call to her and warn her at the same time. She took a deep breath, feeling the cold air burn her lungs, and started to climb. The heavy silence of the night made the steps creak even louder. The light from the lamp made the rough walls look like they were moving, and the shadows looked like they were alive, writhing and stretching. Elelena counted 15 steps before she got to the attic, which was a big room that ran the whole length of the house. It looked just like Catherine had said it would in the letter. White sheets on furniture made ghostly shapes that were all over the room. There were trunks piled up against a wall, warped bookshelves full of books with broken spines, and in the far corner, the west-facing window that Catherine had talked about. It was covered by a thick velvet curtain that kept all light from coming in. Elelena moved slowly forward, taking in everything with her eyes. There were dark lines on the wooden floor that made strange patterns, as if someone had dragged heavy things over the same spots over and over again. There was a circular area in the middle of the attic where dust didn't build up, just like Catherine had said she would be. It looked like someone or something cleaned that area on a regular basis. That's when she heard it. A whisper so low that at first she thought it was just the wind coming through the cracks. But no, there were words there, pieces of sentences that made a creepy melody. Elelena's hair stood on end all over her body. There was something else in the attic with her, a presence that made the space feel full even though it wasn't there. The lamp shook in her hand, and the flame flickered dangerously. Then she saw a chest that was different from the others, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was smaller and more decorated, made of dark wood with metal details that still shone faintly in the light. This chest was clean, unlike the other dusty things, as if someone used it a lot. Elelena walked slowly, making a conscious choice to keep going even though every instinct told her to run away. She knelt in front of the trunk and shook her hands as she lifted the lid. There were dozens of leather-bound notebooks inside, all carefully arranged. She picked up the first one, opened it to the yellowed pages, and started to read by the lamp's flickering light. It was a journal. The earliest entries were decades old and written in a beautiful but increasingly messy style. The merchant who built the house wrote the notes, which showed that he was obsessed. Yes, he wrote about business deals, but in the middle of these boring notes were disturbing passages about experiments he did, theories about what consciousness is and how it can live on after death. Elelena flipped through the pages quickly, her heart racing with each new piece of information. The merchant talked about rituals he did in that attic to try to connect the living world with something beyond it. He talked about times when he felt like something was answering his calls and times when he was only partially successful. And in the last few entries, his writing became almost unreadable. He wrote quickly about how he had finally succeeded and how the door was open and could not be closed again. Elelena looked up from her diary when she heard something. Footsteps on the stairs, someone climbing quickly. She didn't have time to hide what she was doing before someone came out of the dark. It was Dr. Price, who also had a lamp, and looked very worried and urgent. He didn't seem surprised to see her there. In fact, his eyes showed that he knew that moment would come. He walked over, saw the notebooks all over Elena, and let out a deep sigh. Then, in a voice that was low but strong, he started to talk. Dr. Price said that he was also there for certain reasons. He wasn't just a doctor studying the illnesses of minors. He was also an expert on strange things that happened when the mind seemed to go beyond its normal limits. He had heard about that house from people he knew in small academic circles who looked into what they called psychic residues, which are traces left behind by emotionally charged events. He knew about the merchant and his disturbing experiments. He also knew that the house had become a center of strange energy that drew people like Elena, Catherine, who wrote the letter, and others who had felt the pull of that place before. They were all there at that exact moment for a reason. The house chose its visitors in a way that he didn't fully understand yet. Eleanor listened in silence, taking in what she heard. Things were starting to make sense in a strange and scary way. Catherine wasn't crazy when she sent that letter. The visions, the dreams, and the need to go to Knoxville were all part of a bigger pattern that happened over and over again, bringing people together across time and space. Dr. Price sat on the dusty floor of the attic with his lamp next to him, making a double circle of light that kept them safe from the dark around them. Elena stayed on her knees next to the trunk, and the merchant's notebooks were all over the place, like proof of an obsession that had lasted for decades. Outside, the wind howled even more strongly, and the old building creaked and groaned like a living thing fighting against the weather. He started to tell his own story, and Elena knew that she was about to learn things that she had never thought were possible. The doctor talked about how, years ago, when he was still young and just out of school, he had treated a patient in Charleston who kept having visions. She talked about a house in Knoxville in ways that didn't make sense, since she had never been to Tennessee. She talked about an attic where secrets were waiting to be revealed, and a merchant who was obsessed with going beyond the limits of life. At first, Price thought it was a sign of a mental illness, and gave the usual treatments of the time. The woman, on the other hand, said it wasn't crazy. There was something real in those visions that needed to be looked at. She begged him to look into it and go to Knoxville to see if the house really existed. When he finally gave in, it was more out of scientific curiosity than belief. He found out that everything the patient had said was true. The house was exactly as she had seen it in her dreams. That made everything different for him. He stopped working as a doctor and instead focused on studying these events. He did this by gathering stories from other people who had similar experiences with certain places. He found out that he wasn't the only one on this quest. Other researchers were also working on similar problems, coming up with theories about how certain places could hold memories of past events, as if the building materials themselves absorbed and radiated memories. Elena listened with interest, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the diary she was holding without her realizing it. She wanted to know if all the people who felt the house's pull were women, and if there was a pattern to it. Price nodded slowly, confirming what she thought. Yes, they had all been women of a certain age, all with a certain level of sensitivity and an openness to experiences that weren't normal. It was as if whatever lived in that house specifically wanted that kind of connection. But there was more, he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Not all of the women who answered the call of the house could handle what they found. Some ran away in fear after just one night. Others became obsessed and refused to leave, slowly losing themselves in their own minds until family members had to come and get them. And then there were those who just vanished, leaving the boarding house in the middle of the night without their things and never being seen again. Elena felt a shiver run down her back. She thought about Catherine and how she got the letter. She asked the doctor if he knew that name and if Catherine was one of the women who answered the phone at the house. Price closed his eyes for a moment, as if he were remembering something painful. Yes, he had known Catherine. She had been at the boarding house 3 years earlier, in the winter of 1896. She had been one of those who had delved deepest into the mysteries of the house, who had spent the most time in that attic trying to decipher the merchant's notebooks. And then, on a particularly cold January night, Catherine had simply left. She didn't take her bags, didn't leave a message, just vanished as if she'd never been there. Mrs. Crowley, at the time still relatively new to the role of landlady, was disturbed but not surprised. This had happened before, she said softly at the time, and it would probably happen again. It was the price the house exacted from those who tried to unravel its deepest secrets. Nina felt tears burning her eyes. The woman who wrote that urgent letter and begged someone to keep looking had been lost in the process. The letter must have been written just before she went missing, as a last-ditch effort to make sure the truth didn't die with her. And somehow, through paths that Nina would probably never fully understand, that last message had made its way to her in Nashville. Dr. Price stood up, and his joints creaked as he did so. He walked to the window, which was covered by a heavy curtain. He stopped for a moment, then pulled the velvet aside. The light from the lamp wasn't strong enough to see much through the glass, but the snow reflected a ghostly glow that let him see the trees in the distance, which were black shapes against the endless white. He talked about the ideas he had come up with over the years. He said that some places could hold something he called residual consciousness. This was not spirits in the traditional sense, or ghosts as storytellers described them, but pieces of thoughts and feelings so strong that they somehow left their mark on reality itself. And the merchant, with his obsessive experiments and rituals in that attic, would have made this natural property of the house even stronger, turning it into a beacon that drew in sensitive people like Nina, Catherine, who wrote the letter, and others before them who couldn't resist the pull of that place. It wasn't a coincidence that they were all there at that exact time. The house chose who came to visit in a way he didn't fully understand yet. Eleanor thought about those words and tried to make sense of them in light of her own life. The dreams that haunted her, the visions of hallways she had never walked but knew very well, and the strong urge to go to Knoxville all made sense in that strange theory. There was still one question that bothered her, though. She needed to ask it, even though she was afraid of the answer. Why? She asked. Why did the house choose women in particular? Was there something about their gender that made them more open to this kind of influence? Price turned away from the window, and she could see that he was very uncomfortable. He paused, clearly thinking about how much he should say. Finally, with a voice full of reluctance, he started to talk about the last piece of the puzzle, the one he had taken years to find. Price said that the merchant had not done his experiments by himself. He had a partner, a woman who was just as obsessed with going beyond the limits of death as he was. Official records from that time were unclear and inconsistent, but Price was able to put together bits and pieces from personal letters, diaries of people who lived at the same time, and notes in the margins of old documents. This woman would have played a very important role in the experiments, maybe even more so than the merchant himself. But something had gone very wrong. The exact details were still unclear, hidden under layers of time and planned silence. But the result was clear. The woman had suddenly and inexplicably vanished, and not long after, the merchant's mental health began to decline, leading to his strange death in the basement. It was as if whatever they had called forth or awakened with their rituals had eaten her first, then him, leaving something permanent and unsettling in the house's structure. Nina's mind was racing as she connected the dots and made a picture that was both enlightening and scary. The house wasn't just bringing in women at random. It was looking for something specific. maybe to fill the void left by the female presence that had been lost in the first experiments. In a way, each woman who answered the call was a candidate who was being tested and judged for a reason that wasn't clear yet. That's when they both heard it at the same time, and it was impossible to ignore. Footsteps on the stairs, but not just one person's. Several sets of steps moving up the stairs in an unsettling way. The lamplight flickered, the flames bending as if an invisible breeze touched them, and with the footsteps, voices, whispers that intertwined in a cacophony of sounds that almost formed intelligible words. The first figure to emerge from the staircase was Margaret Sinclair. Her appearance was completely transformed. Her gray hair, always so carefully arranged, fell loosely over her shoulders in a wild tangle. Her eyes had a glassy quality, as if she were seeing through Ellelenina and Dr. Price to something far beyond. She held a lit candle, the wax dripping between her fingers without her seeming to feel the heat. Her lips moved constantly, murmuring words in a language neither of them could identify. Right behind her came Thomas Blackwell, the religious bookseller. He too carried a candle, and his face had that same distant, absent expression, but there was something more unsettling in his eyes, a glint of understanding, as if he had finally found answers to questions that had tormented him for a long time. He didn't look at Ellelenina or Price, his attention completely focused on the empty center of the attic, on that circle where dust never accumulated. Mrs. Crowley was the last to ascend. Unlike the other two, she seemed fully conscious, but there was a profound resignation in every line of her face. Her hands shook as she held her own candle, and tears streamed down her furrowed cheeks without her saying a word. When she finally looked up and met Ellelenina's gaze, there was a silent plea for forgiveness, understanding, and something else in her eyes, maybe a warning or a lament for something that was about to happen that couldn't be stopped. Dr. Price stepped forward, and even though there was a lot of tension, his voice was strong. He called Margaret by name, hoping to reach her through that weird trance. He asked what was happening, why everyone had gone up to the attic at that moment. But she didn't answer, gave no sign of having heard him. He simply continued advancing until he positioned himself at one of the cardinal points around the central circle, his candle raised to chest height. Thomas did the same, positioning himself at another point, creating a geometric pattern. Mrs. Crowley, after a moment of agonizing hesitation, joined them, completing a perfect triangle around that circular area. The three candles pulsed in unison, their flames dancing without any draft. And then, in a synchronized movement that seemed rehearsed but clearly wasn't, they all began to chant something that sounded like an ancient incantation. Ellelenina felt her blood run cold. She recognized that sound. It was exactly what she had heard in her dreams, that disturbing melody that woke her in the middle of the night in Nashville. The same notes, the same hypnotic rhythm. She looked at Dr. Price and saw in his face the reflection of her own terror. He recognized it too, probably from his years studying unexplained phenomena, from accounts of other people who had been in that house. The air in the attic began to change. It grew denser, heavier, as if they were submerged in invisible water. Ellelenina could feel a growing pressure against her eardrums, a low buzzing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The shadows on the walls took on a life of their own, contorting and stretching into shapes that defied the natural laws of light and perspective. And in the center of the circle, where Margaret, Thomas, and Mrs. Crowley kept vigil with their candles, something began to materialize. It wasn't solid, not completely. It was more like a distortion in the air, an area where reality seemed thinner, more permeable. Ellelenina forced her eyes to focus, trying to comprehend what she was seeing, but it was like looking through moving water, all fluid and imprecise. Dr. Price gripped her arm, his voice urgent but controlled. He explained quickly that what the merchant had tried to do, what his experiment sought, was to create a permanent passage, a portal, though he hesitated to use a term so laden with fantastical connotations. But there was no other suitable word. The merchant and his partner had attempted to open a door between planes of existence, between the physical world and something beyond, and they had succeeded, at least partially. But the cost had been immense. The woman who worked with the merchant hadn't disappeared, not exactly. She remained trapped in that in-between space, neither here nor there, her consciousness fragmented and scattered throughout the structure of the house. It was she who called out, generation after generation, searching for someone who could complete what she had begun, someone who could finally free her or perhaps replace her in that eternal limbo. Elelonina felt her heart pounding in her chest. She looked at the three guests who continued their monotonous chant, their expressions blank but somehow resolute. They were instruments, she realized with growing horror. The house had chosen them to play specific roles in that ritual, using them to recreate the conditions the merchant had established decades ago. And she herself, Elelonina understood with sudden and devastating clarity, was the centerpiece. She was the one the presence in the house truly wanted. The distortion at the center of the circle grew, pulsed, gradually gaining definition. For a fleeting instant, Elelonina thought she saw a face forming in that impossible mist, feminine features delicate but distorted by pain or time, she couldn't tell for sure. Eyes that seemed to plead and threaten simultaneously. Lips that moved, forming silent words that Eleanor somehow understood without needing to hear them. "Stay," the ghostly lips said. "Stay and finish what you started. Stay and bring balance to what is out of balance. Stay and let the cycle finally end." Dr. Price pulled Elelonina back, away from the group. His voice had changed. Scientific control had given way to real fear. He yelled at them to leave right away, before it was too late. But Elelonina's legs didn't listen to what her brain told them to do. It was as if invisible roots were holding her to the attic floor, as if the wood under her feet wouldn't let her go. Margaret Sinclair started to talk, but it wasn't her voice. It was something deeper, older, using her vocal cords as an instrument. She spoke of loneliness that spanned decades, of fragmented consciousness between worlds, of the unimaginable pain of existing without form, without purpose, trapped in an eternity of near existence. She spoke of how she had waited so long, called so many times, tried so many candidates who had failed or run away. And then Margaret turned to look directly at Eleanor, and in those glassy eyes there was a mixture of pleading and command. The voice continued, explaining that Elelonina was different from the others. Elelonina had the strength, the sensitivity, the disposition needed. Through Eleanor the balance could be restored. Through Eleanor the prison could be broken. But there was a price. There was always a price. To free the trapped consciousness, another needed to take its place. The door between worlds couldn't simply be closed. It was permanent now, an intrinsic part of the house's structure. Someone needed to maintain it, watch over it, serve as an anchor between the planes of existence. That was the role Eleanor was being invited, or perhaps compelled, to accept. Dr. Price held on to her arm. He talked quickly, desperately trying to get through the fog that seemed to be settling over Eleanor's mind. He said it was a lie and a trap, and that if she believed it, she would lose herself forever. That Catherine had probably been in the same situation and had made the only smart choice, to run away while she still could. Eleanor had to fight the influence and remember who she was and what her life was like outside of that awful house. But Eleanor was torn. Part of her, the part that still worked, agreed with Price and yelled at her to run. But another part of her, which was getting stronger, whispered that it made sense. She had always known deep down that her path would lead her to this moment. The dreams, the visions, and Catherine's letter had all been preparing her for that final choice. The distortion in the middle of the circle kept getting bigger and clearer, to the point where it seemed real, and with it came an attraction that Elelonina couldn't resist, like emotional gravity pulling her forward. Her feet started to move against her will, taking small but steady steps towards the vortex of distorted reality. Dr. Price stood between Elelonina and the circle, his arms outstretched as if he could physically stop the force that was pulling her down. His words came out in a desperate stream, each sentence trying to keep Eleanor grounded in reality and remind her of who she was before that house took over her life. He talked about Nashville, the life she had left behind, and the people who were probably waiting for her and would miss her if she just disappeared like so many others had before her. Eleanor could barely hear him, though. She was having a lot of memories that weren't hers. She saw the attic as it had been decades ago, with only a central table and candles arranged in complicated patterns around it. She saw the merchant, a tall man with a thick beard and feverish eyes. He was chanting words in a language that sounded both old and strange, and his hands were moving in ritual ways. And she saw the young, beautiful woman next to him with dark hair that fell in curls over her shoulders. Her lips were also making the same forbidden words. Elelonina could feel the woman's feelings as if they were her own, the thrill of finding something new and the absolute certainty that they were about to do something that people had been trying to do since the beginning of time. The door between life and whatever was beyond was there, and they could reach it with just enough willpower to open it. They had read ancient texts for years, compared rituals from different cultures, and boiled down the most important parts of rituals that had been around for thousands of years and across continents. And then, at the most important moment, when reality started to bend and twist between them, something went wrong. Elelonina saw that moment through the woman's broken memories. Yes, the ritual worked, but not in the way they had both thought it would. The door had opened not just as a way to get in, but also as a hole that needed to be filled. And the woman, who was standing at a certain point in the circle, had been pulled into that middle space before she could do anything. Elelonina could clearly remember that there was no physical pain, but there was something worse. Her identity was slowly fading away, and her consciousness was breaking up into thousands of pieces that scattered throughout the house like paint in water. The woman had tried to scream, but she couldn't anymore. She had tried to get in touch with the merchant, but she didn't have any hands anymore. She was stuck in that awful state. She was aware, but not there. There, but not there. And she was in every floorboard, every beam of the ceiling, and every brick of the walls. After that, the merchant slowly lost his mind. Elelonina saw through the eyes of the broken woman how he spent whole days in the attic trying to fix what he had done and get his partner back. But there was no way back, at least not the way he thought. The woman was stuck in the doorway, and the only way to get her out was for someone else to take her place. This would keep the door open, but it would no longer be stable. Eleanor suddenly came back to the present. Dr. Price shook her shoulders and called her name over and over again in a different voice. She cried a lot, but she didn't know if they were her own tears or the tears of the woman who was trapped. She blinked and tried to focus on the worried eyes of the doctor in front of her. She tried to separate her own thoughts from the flood of other people's memories. Elelonina could now understand what Margaret, Thomas, and Mrs. Crowley were saying as they chanted. It wasn't modern language, it was a mix of Latin and Aramaic pieces and something even older that she knew without having studied it. They were words that opened doors, called forth, and invited forces that people can't understand to come into the physical world. The distortion in the middle of the circle now pulsed with its own light, a glow that didn't come from anywhere but seemed to come from the very distorted texture of the air. Elelenina finally saw the woman's face clearly in that light that shouldn't have been there. It was beautiful and scary at the same time. It looked like it was made of glowing mist instead of flesh and bone, and it was perfectly preserved. The lips of the ghost moved again, and this time Elelenina heard the words in her mind, not with her ears. The voice was soft, but it had the weight of years of sadness and loneliness. She begged, not with words of command, but with real begging. She didn't want to live like that anymore, with her thoughts all over the place, and only being able to see the world without really interacting with it. It was a life worse than any death, a purgatory that seemed to go on forever. Elelenina's heart filled with real compassion. That woman wasn't a monster or a demon. She was just someone who had gone too far in her quest for knowledge and paid a terrible price for it. She needed a break. She needed to be free from that prison for the rest of her life. But the cost of that freedom was too high. It seemed cruel beyond belief to ask someone else to bear that burden. It looked like Dr. Price had come to the same conclusion. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer and full of deep sadness. He said he understood how bad it was for that trapped consciousness, and that he wished he could help. But he couldn't let Elelenina die because there were probably other ways to fix the problem. He suggested that they study more, come back with enough knowledge, and find a way to permanently close the door without needing a conscious anchor. But the people in the circle acted like they were going to panic. The light flashed violently. The air in the attic was so thick that it was hard to breathe, and the inner voice screamed that there was no time, no other way, and that this moment was special and needed to be taken. Every time the house was opened, it lost more energy, which made everything less stable. If this wasn't fixed right away, the house would start to fall apart, taking everyone inside with it. Elelenina looked around the attic and saw the signs she had missed before in a new light. Cracks in the walls that she hadn't seen before, and floorboards that looked like they were rotting from the inside out. The air itself felt sick, as if reality in that space was actually falling apart. The presence was telling the truth. The situation was bad and getting worse by the minute. Margaret Sinclair stumbled and almost dropped her candle. Even though it was very cold, she was sweating and her face was pale. Thomas also looked very tired. His lips were still moving to say the ritual words, but his eyes were starting to roll back. Mrs. Crowley was now openly crying, with bright trails of tears running down her cheeks, but she kept doing her part in the ritual with a sense of hopelessness. Eleanor then realized that it wasn't just about her. If she said no or ran away like Catherine did, things would only get worse. Other women would be called, and other innocent people would be pulled into that awful cycle. The house would still be an open wound in reality, bleeding a disturbing effect on everyone around it. There might have been a better way to do things. Dr. Price may have been right about wanting to learn more, but how many people would have to suffer in the meantime? How many lives would be ruined or lost? She thought about Catherine and how she must have had to deal with the same problem. Catherine had chosen to run away, and Elelenina didn't blame her for it. It was a perfectly logical choice, since her instinct to survive was stronger than any sense of duty or compassion. But Catherine had to live with that choice for the rest of her life, knowing what she had left behind, and feeling like she had to write that letter in the hope that someone else could do what she hadn't. Dr. Price held Elelenina's hands tightly, so she had to look at him. Her eyes were red, which could have been from being tired or holding back tears. He told her that he would respect whatever choice she made, but he begged her to think carefully and not let guilt or the pressure of that moment get to her. He told her that if she left, he would stay, keep studying, and find another way. She didn't have to be the one to bear that impossible weight. Elelenina held his hands tightly and felt the strength of another person who cared about her well-being. It gave her a sense of stability and helped her see things more clearly through the fog of her own feelings and memories of other people. She took a deep breath and then another one to slow down her racing heart. She had to think. She really needed to think about every aspect of that choice that wasn't possible. Eleanor shut her eyes to block out the disturbing pictures.